Hey everyone, today I'm going to be going over all of the spell changes for Prot in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Pretty much every spell gets changed at least a little bit, so let's just hop right into it. First off, let's take a look at the spells that make up our primary rotation. Shield of Righteousness, Hammer of the Righteous, Consecration, Judgment, and Holy Shield. Shield of Righteousness is a new spell learned at level 75 with a second rank at level 80. It does your block value as damage plus additional damage, has a 6-second cooldown, and procs Seal of Command Cleave and Seal of Vengeance instant damage if Seal of Vengeance dot is already active on the target, but will not proc Seal of Vengeance dot. After 2400 block value, there are diminishing returns on how much damage is actually gained from block value, and a hard cap of 2760 block value, at which point block value will no longer increase the damage of Shield of Righteousness. Hammer of the Righteous is our new 51 point talent and another 6-second cooldown in our rotation. It does 4 times our weapon DPS as damage to our target and 2 other targets, 3 when glyphed, for 3 to 4 total targets, and proc seals. Does scale with attack power. In the beginning, Shield of Righteousness will do a little bit more damage than Hammer of the Righteous, but will quickly be outscaled. You'll have way more attack power in raids, which increases the effectiveness of Hammer of the Righteous, and our tier 7 2-piece set bonus also increases the damage of Hammer of the Righteous by 10%. Since the damage is close between Hammer of the Righteous and Shield of Righteousness, I recommend using Hammer of the Righteous first when raid buffed, since it will proc the Seal of Vengeance dot, and using Shield of Righteousness as your second 6-second ability will allow it to proc Seal of Vengeance instant damage since the dot will already be up. Next, we've got Consecration, Holy Shield, and Judgment. Consecration now scales with 4% attack power and spell power per tick. It's relatively weaker than in TBC, but it's still good. Holy Shield now scales with 11.7% of spell power and 7.32% of attack power. I'll go in depth about changes to Judgment in the next section. For now, all you need to know is that you should always have at least 1 point in improved judgments to bring the cooldown to 9 seconds. A second point in Imp Judgments only benefits us during Bloodlust when we have a reduced global cooldown, but there usually isn't anything super worthwhile to put this 1 point in at this part of the ret tree either, so I generally pick it up. So how do all these spells fit together in the rotation? The Prot rotation is often called the 969 rotation. This refers to the cooldowns of the spells and how they're weaved together so that you never have an open global cooldown. The name can be a little confusing because 2, potentially 3 of the spells we're referring to as 9s are actually 8-second cooldowns. Consecration, Holy Shield, and Judgment if you do the 2 talent points. The 2 6-second cooldowns are Shield of Righteousness and Hammer of the Righteous. So to make this rotation flow smoothly, we're going to alternate back and forth between 9-second cooldowns and 6-second cooldowns. You'll always be precasting Holy Shield before a pull happens, and then you can cast Exorcism, Avenger's Shield, and Hand of Reckoning all at the same time with this macro. Make sure to spam it so that the Hand of Reckoning actually deals damage because it won't deal damage if the mob is already targeting you. Exorcism is now a 1.5-second cast and usable on all mob types, but it will always crit against undead and demons. It scales with 15% of attack power and spell power. Avenger's Shield is now instant cast and scales with 7% attack power and spell power, and it can be glyphed to increase the damage by 100%, but it will only hit one target when glyphed. You can start your single target rotation either with Shield of Righteousness / Hammer of the Righteous or Judgment. Judgment does very little damage, but it puts up debuffs, gives a block value buff with the Emblem Librum, which will increase Shield of Righteousness damage, and has a 10-yard range. The extra range isn't super impactful in your opener, as the 5-yard gap advantage it has over the 6s will be closed extremely quickly when you and a boss are moving towards one another. Starting with Shield of Righteousness or Hammer of the Righteous will give you more snap threat, but this probably won't matter if you've already landed the Exo, Avenger's Shield, and Hand of Reckoning combo, and are getting a misdirection on the pull. If your threat on the pull is limiting your DPSers, start with Hand of the Righteous or Shield of Righteousness, and if your DPS are not limited by your pull threat, use Judgment first to get debuffs and buffs up more quickly. A typical single target rotation would look like this. Judgment into Hammer of the Righteous, into Consecration, into Shield of Righteousness, into Holy Shield, into Hammer of the Righteous again. And then you'll just continue to go back and forth between the 9s and 6s. Keep in mind, Holy Shield lasts 2 seconds longer than its cooldown now, so it can be kept up 100% of the time without using it right when it comes off CD, if you aren't taking too many attacks. Also, with Crushing Blows effectively gone, it's less important to have it up 100% of the time, but you should still try to have really high uptime. Once you get through the initial round of the rotation, it gets pretty simple because you'll just have one ability available at a time. If you're using a 6-second first, your rotation would look like this. Hammer of the Righteous into Judgment, into Shield of Righteousness, into Consecration, into Hammer of the Righteous again, into Holy Shield. I have my rotation weak aura set up with 6s on the left and 9s on the right to make the rotation more visually clear. If you like my rotation weak aura, you can find that in the video description. For AoE threat, you'll start with Holy Shield precasted as always, and then you can Avenger Shield 3 mobs and Hand of Reckoning 1 before anything targets you, so that it does damage. You can also start with an Exo on 1 mob if you want, but usually it isn't worth stopping to cast for trash. Your AoE rotation will look like this. Hammer of the Righteous, into Consecration, into Shield of Righteousness, into Judgment, into Hammer of the Righteous, into Holy Shield. Now for Seals and Judgments. These have been reworked quite a bit in Wrath. Seals now last 30 minutes instead of 30 seconds and aren't consumed by using Judgment. Judgment is now on the global cooldown and it's split up into 3 separate spells. Judgment of Light, Judgment of Wisdom, and Judgment of Justice. The damage caused by a Judgment spell will vary depending on your currently active seal, and there are no longer seals that cause Judgment to put up a unique debuff. The debuffs now come from the specific Judgment spell you choose. The Judgment of the Crusader debuff no longer exists. One thing that confuses a lot of people is that you'll notice on certain Librams they'll occasionally reference things like Judgment of Command. This is just how any judgment used while Seal of Command is active is referenced in the combat log. So using any of the 3 new judgment spells while Seal of Command is active will be Judgment of Command. This same logic applies to all seals. Judgment of Wisdom procs will restore 2% of base mana, while Judgment of Light will restore 2% of max HP on proc. Seal of Vengeance / Corruption and Seal of Command are the 2 primary seals you'll be using in Wrath. Seal of Vengeance has 2 components, a damage over time effect that stacks up to 5 and scales with 2.5% attack power and 1.3% spell power per stack. It also has an instant damage component that scales with 6.6% weapon damage per stack. Judgment of Vengeance scales with 14% of attack power and 22% spell power, dealing 10% additional damage per stack. Seal of Command has been reworked and now has a cleave effect when used with single target attacks. Auto attacks and Shield of Righteousness will proc the cleave effect. Hammer of the Righteous will proc non-cleave command on any target hit, so 4 total Seal of Command hits if you have the Hammer of the Righteous glyph and hit 4 targets with it. Judgment can also proc the cleave effect of Seal of Command and the instant damage of Seal of Vengeance, but you must be specced into at least 1 point in Judgments of the Just, otherwise they will not proc off of Judgment. Seal of Command scales with 36% of weapon damage, and Judgment of Command scales with 19% of weapon damage, 8% of attack power, and 13% of spell power. Seal of Light now scales with 15% of attack power and spell power, while Seal of Wisdom restores 4% of max mana. Seal of Righteousness is now only used at lower levels before you get Seal of Vengeance / Corruption or Command. The next big changes to talk about are Hands and Blessings. Hands are a new category of spells, all of which used to be blessings. This is a great change because you used to have to rebuff anytime you wanted to use things like Blessing of Freedom or Protection, but not anymore. Each pally can only have 1 hand spell active on the same target at a time. The new spells in this category are Hand of Freedom, Hand of Protection, Hand of Sacrifice, and Hand of Salvation. Hand of Freedom works the same as Blessing of Freedom, except it now only lasts 6 seconds. Hand of Protection works exactly the same as Blessing of Protection. Hand of Sacrifice is now a 2-minute cooldown and transfers 30% of damage taken to the caster and lasts for 12 seconds or until 100% of the caster's max HP has been transferred. This is a pretty significant buff from the old Blessing of Sacrifice that only transferred a static amount of damage from each hit. As a prop pally, this can be extremely useful for keeping your other tank alive during times you're not tanking or taking very little damage. Hand of Salvation is now a 2-minute cooldown that reduces the target's threat by 2% per second for 10 seconds. This is significantly different from the old Blessing of Salvation that was a 30-minute buff that reduced threat by 30%. To make up for the old Blessing of Salvation going away, Blizzard added a plus 43% hidden all threat bonus to Righteous Fury. Quick note, Righteous Fury's wholly specific threat component is lowered to 80% in Wrath, but overall, threat is much higher with the addition of the plus 43% all threat, as well as significantly increased damage dealt by prop allies. Righteous Fury also has infinite duration now, so you don't have to worry about refreshing it unless you die. Hand of Salve is really useful as a prop ally since you can throw it on your highest threat DPS. Communication with your raid will really help maximizing its usefulness. For example, if your Demo Luck is going to pop Demon Form and go hard on AoEing a pack, they can tell you that beforehand so you have Hand of Salve ready to go on them right on the pull. There's also a glyph that causes Hand of Salve to reduce damage taken by 20%, which will be an interesting option when we get into harder hitting bosses in Wrath. Tank threat is so good that in many boss fights, you can afford to take the threat hit for the damage reduction if needed. If the threat loss is an issue, you can use a cancel or a Hand of Salve macro to remove the buff after a boss has used one of their tank buster abilities and the 20% damage reduction is no longer needed. As for blessings, Blessing of Might, Wisdom, and Kings still do the same stuff they did in TBC. One thing to note is that Blessing of Might does not stack with Battle Shout anymore, and Blessing of Wisdom does not stack with Mana Spring Totem anymore. This is part of a new buff and debuff system where most buffs and debuffs are part of a category that can be brought by multiple classes and specs. Blessing of Kings is now a baseline spell instead of requiring a talent point, and Pallies are the only ones who can bring this buff type. Blessing of Light no longer exists. The biggest blessing change is Blessing of Sanctuary. This buff now increases stamina and strength by 10%, but these bonuses do not stack with Kings. Sank also reduces damage taken by 3%, but this buff does not stack with Vigilance from Warriors or Renewed Hope from Disc Priests. The final component of Blessing of Sank is the strongest part. Every time you dodge, parry, or block, you'll restore 2% of your max mana. This has no cooldown and is as crazy as it sounds. If you're having any mana issues, you can simply tank some extra mobs and watch your mana skyrocket. Blessing of Sank is something you will always want to have on yourself. Now let's talk about Forbearance and the spells that cause this effect. His debuff has been reworked a bit from TBC and now lasts 2 minutes. Forbearance now includes self-targeted lay on hands in addition to Divine Shield, Divine Protection, and Hand of Protection. Divine Protection has been reworked to reduce damage taken by 50% for 12 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown with talents. It used to just be a worse version of Divine Shield, but now it's one of our strongest survival cooldowns. Divine Shield works the same as it did before, except now it causes you to deal 50% reduced damage instead of reducing your attack speed. Lay on Hands no longer costs any mana and has a 15-minute cooldown with the minor glyph. Since you get Forbearance when casting Lay on Hands on yourself, this is something you'll look to use on your fellow raid members. Oftentimes, this will be used on the other tank during multi-tank fights. You can have a major impact on your raid if you're watching for good moments to use Lay on Hands on other people. Avenging Wrath now increases damage and healing by 20% instead of increasing only damage by 30%. It also cannot be used within 30 seconds of a Forbearance spell. Auras now affect your entire raid and have a 40-yard range. Sanctity Aura no longer exists. Devotion Aura, Crusader Aura, and Resistance Auras all have the same effects they do in TBC. Retribution Aura now scales with 3.3% of spell power. There's also a new talent in the Holy Tree called Aura Mastery that will double the effect of your active aura for 6 seconds when used. Aura Mastery isn't part of the standard prot build, but may see some play down the line as we get into hard mode raid bosses. You'll be glad to know our taunt gets buffed quite a bit in Wrath. Righteous Defense is now an 8-second cooldown, off the global cooldown, and costs no mana. We also get a new single target taunt, Hand of Reckoning. This one is also an 8-second cooldown and off the GCD. It does 50% of your attack power as holy damage to the target if they are not currently targeting you. This is a great way to get a little extra threat on the pull. With two 8-second cooldown taunts off the global cooldown, it is very easy to deal with situations where someone pulls threat off of you. As you level, you'll get a couple new spells. The first one you'll get at 71, Divine Plea. This restores 25% of your mana over 15 seconds, and Prot gets a talent that refreshes the duration when you melee. So you'll be able to keep this up 100% of the time as long as you're getting a melee attack in every 15 seconds. We also have a glyph that will reduce damage taken by 3% when Divine Plea is active. Divine Plea does reduce the healing of Flash of Light and Holy Light by 50%. This doesn't matter much for us, but occasionally you'll run into situations where you're throwing some heals out, so I like to macro cancel or a Divine Plea into my heals. Before you get Divine Plea, you'll sometimes have mana issues, but those issues are almost completely solved once you get it, outside of some rare situations. We get another new spell at level 80 called Sacred Shield. This gives us an Absorb Shield for 500 plus 75% of spell power when we take damage with a 6-second cooldown. We also get a talent that increases the absorb effect by 20% and doubles the duration from 30 seconds to 1 minute. This spell reduces damage taken by a lot, so you want to make sure you always have this up. If you have a Holy Pally with you, they'll be the one maintaining this, otherwise you'll cast it on yourself. Now for some miscellaneous changes. Divine Intervention is now a 10-minute cooldown instead of 1 hour. Hammer of Justice now interrupts cast for 3 seconds when used on non-players. Divine Sacrifice is a new talent in the Prot tree that redirects 30% of all damage taken by your party members to yourself, up to a maximum of 40% of your HP per group member affected, or until you go below 20% HP. This buff is essentially a group-wide Hand of Sacrifice. With the Divine Guardian talent, this spell gains an even better effect: 20% reduced damage taken for all raid members within 30 yards of you for 6 seconds. Generally, you'll use Divine Sacrifice with a cancel aura macro so that your raid gets the 20% reduced damage buff, but you don't have to deal with the drawback of the damage redirect, since this can often be problematic for a tank. Lastly, Turn Evil has no cooldown instead of a 30-second cooldown. So those are all the spell changes for Prot Pallies in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. If you like what I do and want to support me, easiest way, just liking, subscribing, and commenting. Really appreciate all of you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.